Okay, hello everyone. This is a recap video going over what we looked at last night, which was to create an evolving pad using operator again. I hope you're becoming more familiar with operator, and I hope that's helping you to project the sounds that you hear in your mind more easily into the software using this device. Hopefully that's starting to happen for you the more that we use it in class. We are going to look at FM8 next week for an alternative to this, but let's just go back over what we did last night. So, if you remember, we were trying to create a pad sound, and we said that a pad sound should be kind of a long, sustained note. And the kind of pad that we were trying to create was one that evolved over time. It changed over time. And if you remember, we were using all 4 oscillators with different amplitude envelopes and some other settings on the LFO to make the sound evolve constantly. And you guys did super last night, some amazing, beautiful things. And I'm just going to lay this down in a video for you so that if you've forgotten any of the stages or you can't quite remember how you created the patch last night, then this will be a good starting point for you. Remember that this does take a little bit of fiddling, so it may be quite a long video, this actually. It may be over 10 minutes, but I'll try and keep it quite short and sweet. Okay, so to get started, whenever I'm designing any sort of sound, the first decision I always want to make is, okay, what waveform do I want to form the basis of this sound, the foundation of the sound? So the pads we were making last night, and I find this quite useful, and it works for the type of music that I make. I like to have a little bit of brightness to the sound, but not so much that it's kind of overbearing. So I tend to use, for my pad sounds, I tend to use these saw increments here. Somewhere in the middle, around here, maybe saw 8. So it has got a bit of brightness to it and a bit of like clack and quack to it. But not so much that it's super overbearing. I might push this up a little bit, actually. I'm going to go like saw 16. Yeah, I think that's the one I used last night in class. If I go all the way up to saw 64, you can hear it's like super bright, and you might want that for your particular pad sound, but I always want this kind of middle ground here. Okay, so that's always the first decision that I make whenever I'm creating any sort of synth patches. What waveform do I want to form the foundation of the patch? So I've made that decision for oscillator A. And I'm going to go ahead now and apply an amplitude envelope to this so that it glides in quite slowly, volume-wise, and so that the sound dies away quite slowly as well over a long period of time. And that's so that I can get my pad notes to kind of glide over the top of each other. There are a couple of other things we need to do with the voicing as well, but let's deal with the amplitude envelope first. So, if I want the sound to kind of ramp up over time, I know that I want a long attack envelope on my sound. So I can just click and drag this this value here to get it to the value that I want. Or I can type. I can click and I can type. So I'm going to say like, it's in milliseconds, this value. So 3,200 milliseconds is 3.2 seconds. Let's have a listen to that. That's okay. I don't want this first envelope to be super long, at least not just yet. The attack envelope, the attack stage at least. Because I want the other sounds to come in after. When we start to layer this up oscillator-wise, I do want there to be some time after this one for other things to happen. So, about 3 seconds is cool for me. Decay and sustain, I'm not going to mess with for this particular pad. At least not for oscillator A, because I want the sound to sustain for as long as I hold the note. And I want it to retain pretty much a constant volume of 0 dB as well, so I'm not going to touch it. But I am going to affect the release here. I'm going to push the release out quite considerably, maybe over 10 seconds. Let's have a listen. Cool. So a nice gradual decay of the sound to silence. That's going to work for me, but if you remember last night, if I'm going to go ahead and record a clip now as well. So have I got a count in set? Nope, let me put one on. 1, 2, 3, and. Okay. And there's the problem in action. Listen to the end of the clip. So the sound stops. The notes don't overlap. When the clip comes back to the start and it receives new MIDI notes, it kind of cuts off our release stage, which I don't want. I want the sounds to glide and overlap over each other. So we had to change the voicing for this, and we had to change the retrigger option. You'll find it inside of the global routing section down here. Click where the little coloured squares are, and then in the bottom left-hand corner of the main display, we're going to turn retrigger off and increase our voices as well, just in case, because this pad's going to get pretty heavy once we start adding extra oscillators and things. So I'm going to put mine up to 16, but remember there is a payoff with this. The more voices you use in, the more CPU is being used. So do be aware of that when you're designing complex instruments like this. So it's the retrigger really that's doing the work here. I'm going to replay the clip. Cool. So now, with the retrigger turned off, when a new MIDI note is received, it doesn't cut the old one off. It keeps that one rolling and lets the other one overlap over the top of it. So we get this nice smooth glide between notes. Really important that for this type of sound, unless you wanted to create a kind of pad sound that did stop abruptly at any point, but for me, I want this off. Really important. So there's our amplitude envelope. Quite a long attack, super long release for me. And I've turned the voices up and turned the retrigger off. Now it's time to start adding the extra oscillators in. And the first thing you're going to want to do here is make a decision about your oscillator routing. So I'm going to jump back to this section where we had the voices. And it's this graphic along the top that you want to pay attention to here. And we did go over this in class, and hopefully you remember what these little graphs mean. The one right at the end here on the right-hand side, this is kind of an additive synth mode where you're just combining waveforms. You're just adding them. And they all appear on the bottom row of this graph, of this diagram, and they've all got a little wire symbol coming out of it, a little output symbol. And that means that they're all generating their own sound. Over this side, only oscillator A is generating sound. That's the only one that's got the little output wire coming out into blank space. So that's the only one generating sound. And the other three oscillators, B, C, and D, are all being used for frequency modulation. And you get vastly different timbres depending on the routing of your oscillators. So last night I got you to start in additive synthesis mode, and that's totally up to you. I'm actually going to pick something in between. So now that you understand what these little diagrams mean, you can kind of decode what each one means. And this one here gives me the option where I have two oscillators generating sound. A and C will generate sound for me, and B and D will be used to modulate those oscillators. Frequency modulation will occur. I'm going to go for that. Slightly different to what I did last night. Hopefully I'll get a different result. And here we go. I'm going to start adding my extra oscillators. I think I'm going to just start by adding oscillator C, since that's the one that's going to generate my second sound. I'm going to pick a waveform, first and foremost. Let's pick... I'm going to pick a square sound. Let's go for like square 32. And then I'm going to push the volume up to around the same as the first oscillator. Jump into my envelope. And if you remember, I want to copy this envelope from oscillator A just as a starting point. I can right-click in the envelope view and say copy envelope from oscillator A. Take that. But I want this oscillator to come in after oscillator A. I want it to be, again, part of the evolution of the sound is, additional layers coming in at different times. So I'm going to push this out. I'm going to push this so that this should appear sonically after 12 seconds. And maybe I'll push the release out a little bit further so that it even dies away more slowly than the other one. I might make a decision here to actually bring the peak volume of this down so that it never is as loud as the first oscillator. So maybe I'm going to say that I want it to be peaking at -6 dB. And so I'm matching the peak value and the sustain value here, just so that it's never going to be as loud as this first oscillator. Okay, now this is the trial and error bit where we kind of have to keep listening. Not super apparent what's happening here, and if you remember last night, to make it more obvious, I increased the pitch of this oscillator so we could hear it. There we go. I'm going to be making changes as I go here, because I like to react to the sound as it's happening. So I won't be explaining everything I do here, I'm just going to be making changes on the fly. Okay, I'm happy enough with that. I'm happy enough with how each oscillator sounds, at least for the time being. So I'm going to go ahead and start to bring in oscillators B and D to the mix. But remember that oscillators B and D do not generate their own sound in this case. They're going to be used to for frequency modulation on oscillators A and C. They're going to be used to change the sound of oscillators A and C. So the first thing I'm going to do is select oscillator B. Right click and copy envelope from oscillator A again. And I'm going to push out the attack value. Hello. I'm going to push out the attack value of this oscillator so that it appears more gradually, sonically. We'll start to hear it more gradually than oscillator A. I'm going to be quite liberal with this. Let's go for 12,000 milliseconds, 12 seconds. And I'm even going to push the release out a little bit here as well, make it longer. And then obviously in order to hear this in action, we have to push the level up. Don't forget that. So I'm going to push this up as we listen to it. Just on. So anyway, yeah, you can hear how this oscillator is interacting with this one. It's changing the sound of it, and this fine-tune option here is actually quite powerful. This is similar to when we looked at it in the Hoover patch, where we used detuning to create this kind of warping of the sounds between three oscillators in that case. Same thing's happening here. Very small changes to this fine-tune will result in pretty big changes, so do be careful with it, but I'm just going to have a couple more seconds tweak with this. No, I like it there, that's fine. Okay, cool, I really love how that oscillator is interacting with oscillator A. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that and move on to oscillator D. First thing again, select, right click and copy envelope from oscillator A, and again push this attack stage out so that it comes in more gradually. And then push the level up. I might go ahead and change the waveform and stuff here. I am just going to do this on the fly, so bear with me. Okay, cool. I made a few changes there to the oscillator. I changed the waveform here to a square wave. I push the attack out. Let's push the release out a little bit as well. And I change the pitch, push the volume up. Nothing crazy. And I'm happy with that as a starting point. I'm going to go ahead and start to interact with other things in the synth now that are going to help with this evolution of sound over time. The other thing that we engaged with was the LFO. The LFO is a really useful tool for creating evolution of the sound over time, changing the sound over time. LFO stands for low frequency oscillator, and it's used to change another parameter inside of the synth at a rate and amount that we set. We have to activate the LFO first by selecting this little button here, and the section kind of lights up and the main display changes as well. By default, we want to look at this destination A section here. This is where the LFO is going to be routed to and what it's going to affect. And A, B, C, and D are lit up here, which means that the LFO will change the pitch of oscillators A, B, C, and D. That's not something I want in my patch, so I am going to go ahead and turn those off. But let's hear it first, just so that you know how it sounds. So you can hear that. It's waving the pitch over time. I'm going to leave this on actually while I demonstrate the rate and the amount. So the rate is how fast that change will occur, and the amount is how deep or how extreme that change will be. Okay, so with the pitch activator, you can really hear the LFO, and you can hear what each of these does. This makes the parameter change more deep, more extreme, and this is how fast it is. We've also got a couple of options here for the shape of the LFO, and if you remember last night, I demonstrated with a couple of these. Sine gives us that nice kind of smooth transition between values, whereas square just jumps between them. Sounds pretty cool though. And the other one I demonstrated last night was this sample and hold, which is kind of like a random option. Oi, oi. Okay, so yeah, the pitch. I don't want this patch to modulate the pitch. If you remember last night, again, we looked at doing that sort of thing with a frequency shifter audio effect. I'm going to turn it off inside this patch. I'm going to turn off A, B, C, and D inside the oscillator, inside the LFO section. What I do want to route my LFO through to is the filter here. So I'm going to select filter on this part of the operator. Let's put it back to sine for the time being, and I'm going to play this now. So now instead of the LFO modulating the pitch, changing the pitch, it's going to change this filter. It's going to move this cutoff frequency around automatically. Okay, so you can hear that. You can hear this LFO is changing this cutoff frequency. If you can't hear it, adjust the cutoff frequency. It should become more apparent. Oh, now there's something quite interesting happening here that didn't happen last night when I was demonstrating. But can you hear that abrupt change in the sound there? And this was happening for a couple of you guys last night. There's a reason that's happening. The LFO has its own envelope. Remember that envelopes are just like a concept in synthesis, and they can be applied to multiple things. LFOs are no exception. And on this particular LFO envelope, you see we have a really short release time. And this is how long the LFO will keep hold of the parameter that you've told it to after the MIDI note has been finished, after we receive a note off message. And the conflict's happening here because we have a really long amplitude envelope and a very short LFO envelope. So when the MIDI note stops here, the LFO basically lets go of the filter, and that's why we get, or it lets go of it after 50 milliseconds, which is a really short amount of time. And that's why we get that super abrupt change in the sound. Let's listen again. Listen for it around here. So you see, it's as soon as the MIDI note like lets go, as soon as we get a note off message, we get this really short release from the LFO applied to the filter. What I'm going to do to combat this is I'm going to push up the release of the LFO envelope so that it matches or exceeds the amplitude envelopes we have set here. So what's our longest one? I mean, we've got some really long ones here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push this release for the LFO section up to 30 seconds, and that should cover it. 30,000 milliseconds, 30 seconds. Let's listen again. So there, did you hear it? We had a more gradual overlap of the LFO applied to the filter after the note off message had been received, and that was because I pushed this release time up. I guess we could have got rid of that by disabling this retrigger button as well, which is something that I would advise you do anywhere when trying to create these types of pads in particular, where everything's kind of free-flowing and evolving over time. This retrigger option basically does the same sort of thing, where it tells the LFO to keep going and not reset its cycle once a note off message has been received, or actually when a new MIDI note has been received. Turn it off if you want your LFO to just be very free and not reacting to new MIDI notes. Okay, I'm going to have a little bit of an experiment here, mess around and try and get something that I like. So please bear with me. Now I am going to go for this kind of smooth, kind of floating pad. I'm pushing the resonance up here, and if you notice, the more I push it up, I'm actually getting clipping on my signal. I can see it here on the audio output on the synth. To combat that, I'm going to drop the synth volume a little bit. Cool, perfect. Now I'm not peaking over 0 dB. Resonance, remember, adds extra volume, extra color around the frequency range that you've got selected here, and it does result in extra volume. So always a good idea to kind of pull your master volume down to as a consequence of that. Okay, cool. I mean, we could go all day experimenting here, but I think I'm going to leave it at that. Remember to experiment with the other filter types as well, which is something I didn't tell you to do last night. You probably did, but they'll give you vastly different results as well. So this is a band pass. Just isolates a small area. High pass for that brighter sound. Oh, pardon me. I'm going to stick with low pass for mine. Ooh, just zoning out a little bit. Okay, what else do I need to show you here? Yeah, cool. This is something I didn't show in class last night, but the LFO, we can route it to these destinations here, A, B, C, and D, the pitch of those oscillators and the filter, but underneath that we have a second destination, destination B, and this is a drop-down menu. Can you see where it says off? I'm going to click that, and we get a list, and here we can send the LFO to a bunch of different destinations. We could send it to just change one volume of an independent oscillator, A, B, C, or D. We can get it to change the overall volume. We can get it to shift the panorama, so get it to swing the sound from left to right. The one I'm going to point you to today here is, look, we've got this LFO rate. So we can actually change the rate of the LFO from inside the LFO itself, which I find really interesting, and it gives you some really cool results because this LFO rate is now going to shift around. It's not going to remain static. Let's have a listen and see if we can hear it in action. I'm going to push the amount up a little. Nothing super apparent yet. Oh, there we go. It's actually being super subtle here and kind of showing me up a little bit. There we go. Little moments like that will occur when you change the LFO rate using the LFO itself. It's kind of like self-modulating. I find it really interesting. It's changing the speed of the LFO. So every now and again you will get this change in the speed of that modulation. Sometimes it kind of really spikes through and erupts for a second. Other times it will kind of die away to nothing, and then it'll return back to your kind of steady pace. I just find it quite interesting and something that I've been using a lot recently. So go ahead and try that too. I'm going to leave it there. This has turned out a super long video. Apologies. And if you remember last night that we took this way further than this, we added audio effects to the chain. We just drop and drag them from the audio effects. We were working with delays and reverbs last night to really space this sound out into this kind of vast soundscape, textured soundscape. And then we grouped the audio effects with the instrument itself. We grouped them together to create an instrument rack, and then we were mapping parts of the synth and parts of the audio effects across to macros at the front so that we could perform with this patch. I'm not going to go over that again. We've covered racking things up a lot in class, and it's something we're going to continue to do in class, so I'm not going to cover that again. So that's it. This is going to act as a good little reference point for you if you kind of forgotten what we did last night, or it's, you know, you just wanted it as a reference point for a starting point when you come to create your own pad sounds. That's going to be it for me for this video. Next week we're going to look at FM8. If you want to do a little bit of research on that beforehand or try and have a little play with it in the edit suites or studios, please do. But that's it for this video. Hope it helps. So this is me signing off. Peace, peace, peace.